If you ever wander into a bookstore, you might just find this book, 1421, The Year China Discovered America by Gavin Menzies. Actually, newer versions of the book have a new subtitle, The Year China Discovered the World. Okay, so as the name suggests, Menzies, an ex-submariner, argues that decades before Columbus, Chinese explorers sailed across the entire planet. Not only did they discover North America, but South America and Greenland too, and the Arctic, and they also spread technology and established colonies, all before quickly returning home. This circumnavigation of the entire planet apparently took place between March 1421 and October 1423. Now, a Chinese fleet under the command of Admiral Zheng He did sail throughout the Indian Ocean in the early 1400s. I'll talk more about the real history throughout the video, but the reason we know this is because plenty of historical evidence backs it up. Historians have to use real proof for their claims. Gavin Menzies doesn't have any actual proof that Zheng He's sixth voyage, or any Chinese voyage, sailed beyond the Indian Ocean. He has hundreds of pages of random, twisted clues, an entire ocean of evidence that's just 1 centimeter deep. He uses myths, mundane artifacts, misinterpreted maps, chickens. He even argues that the Chinese population of California might have gotten there before white people because vibes, really. But anyways, instead of just dismissing him as a crackpot, let's actually go through his book and look at his claims with an open mind. This is what, why, how, and that's what the video's about. If you like this sort of thing, don't forget to subscribe. Also on my Patreon, you'll find an expanded script with more content. Okay, so let's talk briefly about what actually happened so nobody's confused. Between 1405 and 1433, a huge Chinese fleet under the command of Admiral Zheng He sailed from China on 7 voyages. This was a huge achievement. The fleet sailed from China to Southeast Asia and throughout the Indian Ocean, making it as far as Mecca and Madagascar, before of course returning home to China. The Chinese Emperor Zhu Di built, financed, and sent these dozens of ships and tens of thousands of sailors abroad, not to conquer new lands, open up trade, or even for exploration, really. These were diplomatic, political missions whose purpose was to bring new lands into the Chinese tributary system. Zhu Di wanted more princes and kings to submit to his authority as the Son of Heaven. We call this fleet a treasure fleet because they brought tribute in the form of treasure back to China. You can read more about this in the book Zheng He by Edward Dreyer. How do we know anything about Zheng He's voyages at all? Well, historians primarily turn toward plenty of actual historical texts written about them. There are 3 written accounts of the voyages, the best of which was written by Ma Huan. Like other sources, I've posted a link right to it below. These accounts are pretty detailed for a source from 600 years ago. We know for a fact that Ma Huan was on the 6th voyage Gavin Menzies claims sailed across the entire planet. On this voyage, which Zheng He probably returned home early from, the Chinese ships brought visiting ambassadors back to important places in Southeast Asia and the northern coast of the Indian Ocean before turning back home for China, filtering back to the homeland over the course of late 1422 and 1423. So if we already know from Ma Huan that this voyage didn't go beyond Asia, then what is 1421 even talking about? Menzies bypasses the tricky obstacle of actual textual sources by claiming, as Ma Huan's account makes clear with his role as official chronicler apparently over, he left the treasure fleets at Calicut. There's no evidence for this. Ma Huan even writes about places the voyage went to after Calicut, including Mogadishu and Somalia. Menzies is either lying or deluding himself. Even if Ma Huan wanted to quit halfway through the voyage, he did include information on voyages he didn't go on, given to him by those who did. And guess what? He never mentions any ship sailing across the entire planet, which you think he would have put in his book about all the places the ships visited. These voyages are already major accomplishments worth celebrating, worth investigating, worth learning about. You don't need to exaggerate to tell an interesting story. Okay, so I've already veered away from actual history toward 1421. But before we get into the actual book, let's raise the stakes a bit, because if this was just a random paperback in the bowels of a cheap bookstore, it wouldn't really matter. But it isn't. 1421 is, as the cover proclaims, an international bestseller. Lots of people have read this book, and lots of people believe it's true. PBS even made a documentary version. But it isn't just pop history and public broadcasting. Historical scholars have agreed with Menzies. Well, let's clarify that. Scholars in China, Yunnan University, even made him an honorary professor. Obviously, there's a clear motive for Chinese scholars to promote Menzies. It's the same reason why Afrocentrists claimed Cleopatra was black, or why Eurocentrists claimed Jesus was blonde and blue-eyed. It's because Menzies is a Sinocentrist. He believes that China is wiser and better than the barbaric, deceptive Westerners that stole China's place in the sun. As he writes in his book, instead of the cultured Chinese instructed to treat distant people with kindness, it was the cruel, almost barbaric Christians who were the colonizers. Do you see the problem now? Medieval China wasn't some idyllic Eden. Here at What, Why, How, we reject all centrisms. Every culture and every society has great capacity to cruelty, including China, as history shows. Now, the Chinese government hasn't officially endorsed Gavin Menzies or anything like that. His argument is still fringe to serious scholars, even in China. But the topic, the voyage of Zheng He in the early 1400s, is still important to China's conception of itself on the world stage. When China began its Belt and Road Initiative, which is its plan to invest in the infrastructure of countries across the planet, President Xi Jinping cited the historical precedent of Zheng He. China has exited its isolation and is now competing with the United States for global power. This history is alive today. Okay, so we've talked for a minute about why the book is important solely as a text, but what about its historical argument? If Chinese explorers really did sail across the world in the early 1400s, as Menzies claims, and if they really did plant colonies and spread technology and inspire much of the history of the Americas without us even knowing, and maybe even the Renaissance in Europe too, as he argues in his book 1434, then our understanding of history would be hugely different. This would be a gargantuan discovery, if it were true. So let's start with the introduction. Gavin Menzies' foundational argument, and the one he leans on the most, being a submariner, is that maps depict the Americas before 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Basic logic says this would only be possible if someone besides Columbus explored America to gain that cartographical knowledge, right? So what's the first map he looks at? In his intro, Menzies writes his entire book was inspired by a 1424 map made by a Venetian named Zheng He. This map, alongside the coast of Western Europe, also depicts 4 blobbish islands off in the Atlantic: Satanazes, Antilia, Saya, and Imana. Menzies argues that these islands, painted before Columbus crossed the Atlantic, are actual islands in the Caribbean, including Puerto Rico and Guadalupe. This means someone must have gotten there before 1424 when the map was made, you guessed it, the Chinese. Except we know for a fact that Europeans have been yapping about mythological islands in the Atlantic Ocean for centuries. You can probably think of one right off the top of your head: Atlantis. Believe it or not, there's not a giant Greek island in the middle of the ocean. Antilia also had legends associated with it, but since the first written evidence of any legend of Antilia is in the 1400s, you know what, it's slimly possible that the island was actually real and that someone in Europe discovered it, or at least knew about it. Now, before you give Menzies a point, even if we assume that these islands are real, why would we even entertain the notion that it wasn't the Portuguese who found them, but actually China? Well, Menzies writes, I found a command issued by the Portuguese prince Henry the Navigator to his sea captains in 1431, ordering them to go and find the islands of Antilia. Had the Portuguese discovered them, Henry's edict would scarcely have been necessary. But wait, Zheng He isn't Henry the Navigator. The entire nation of Portugal is not solely embodied in the flesh of Henry the Navigator. A much more likely explanation than China sailing all the way to the Caribbean is that local fishermen sailed to the Caribbean before 1424, or that the islands were just legends. Those rumors of Antilia made it to Prince Henry, who decided they ought to check it out as part of Portugal's contemporary expansion into the Atlantic. Doesn't that make much more sense? I mean, Gavin Menzies even makes the bizarre argument in his later chapter, Colonizing the New World, that Henry the Navigator's sea captains actually sailed across the Atlantic and colonized the Caribbean in 1431, decades before Columbus. If he thinks Portugal had the knowledge and ability to do that in 1431, then why is it so bizarre that some fishermen might have gotten blown off course beforehand, or that the islands were just myths? Why is it so easy for people like Menzies to believe in extraordinary legends over simpler, more rational explanations? Okay, what's next? We can skip through the first 2 chapters of his book. It covers Emperor Zhu Di, the Ming Dynasty, and Zheng He's first voyages. We covered that earlier in the video. Here's a bit we should address though. Menzies correctly points out that during the last voyages of Zheng He, there was a huge isolationist backlash in China against the expenditures and perceived waste of these massive trips abroad. There's a reason why China stopped. According to a source written nearly a century after these events, an isolationist official named Lu Daxia hid, or according to a source written even later, destroyed the accounts of Zheng He's voyages. But wait, we know he didn't destroy all of them because we just talked about Ma Huan's written accounts earlier. Why would this guy just burn accounts about visiting America? Gavin Menzies knows Ma Huan's accounts exist, he mentions them, so he uses all the tricks up his sleeve to explain why Ma Huan didn't write about visiting America. If you have to twist reality so much to make your argument make sense, it doesn't make sense. But let's go to chapter 3. In it, Menzies describes all the different goodies they had on board Zheng He's fleet. He also just makes up a whole bunch of stuff. For example, he says, the crewmen were provided with a uniform, a knee-length white robe. No source says this, there's no proof of it. But why do I care so much? Well, Gavin Menzies puts that on page 64, so on page 163, he can say a legend about white people wearing white clothes crossing the sea to Chile was actually about the Chinese. Same thing for a legend from New Zealand. Shout out to this article by Robert Finlay for pointing that out. Finlay writes, piling supposition upon supposition, Menzies never considers a question that he does not beg. The author's trail of evidence is actually a feedback loop that makes no distinction between premise and proof, conjecture and confirmation, bizarre guess and proven fact. But let's keep going. Chapter 4 of the book covers his claim that the Chinese ships rounded the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. Since he argues that Ma Huan left the boats in India, but somebody must have brought the maps to Europe eventually, he says that a Venetian named Niccolo da Conti hopped aboard the boat, sailed with the Chinese across the planet, then later told the Europeans about China's voyages. That's how they knew about Puerto Rico and put it on a map. Conti actually had a very fascinating life story, kind of a 1400s Marco Polo. While Menzies tries to stuff him into the book 1421, it doesn't really make much sense. If Conti really did sail with the Chinese all across the planet, then why didn't he say anything about that in the actual surviving account of his life, which he directly told Poggio Bracciolini, who wrote it down? We can read that account today. Surely a miraculous adventure to new continents would be worth mentioning in your biography. There are no Chinese eunuchs to burn these books, so Gavin Menzies just ignores this hole in his logic. Oh, also, Conti arrived back in Venice in 1444, 20 years after the Pizzigano map that supposedly depicts Puerto Rico. The years don't add up. Anyways, Gavin Menzies' first piece of actual evidence that the Chinese sailed past South Africa into the Atlantic is this really gorgeous map made by Fra Mauro, a Venetian cartographer working for Portugal, in 1459. This map depicts the bottom of Africa, Cap de Diab in the map, before Europeans reached what we today call the Cape of Good Hope. Well, there's a pretty obvious explanation why this map can depict South Africa. Maybe this Venetian guy just guessed that Africa had a bottom, or maybe someone else reached it there first and told him about it. One of the 1,000 different mercantile cities along the coast of the Indian Ocean could have sent a boat there. Gavin Menzies says it was China. The map does, after all, depict boats that might be Chinese treasure ships. Very interestingly, the map specifically says that a ship from Asia sailed to the bottom of Africa around 1420, which does match with Menzies' thesis. But wait, the map has additional text that Gavin Menzies even puts in his book. The ships sailed towards the west and southwest for 40 days, found nothing but sea and sky. In their estimation, they ran for 2,000 miles and fortune deserted them. They made their return to the said Cap de Diab in 70 days. So even if we assume that this is true and not a legend passed from person to person, the legend doesn't even say the ships that sailed beyond South Africa found land. They just sailed for months, found nothing, and turned back around. You can't rely on a legend that doesn't even say what you want it to say. Next, Gavin Menzies cites another precocious map, the Korean-made Cognito, which apparently depicts Africa so accurately that there cannot be a shred of doubt that it was charted by someone who had sailed around the Cape. This is where you start to wonder if Gavin Menzies is delusional. Is this vague blob supposed to be shockingly accurate? Africa is a shapeless, elongated mass of hanging dough with no detail and a giant ocean in the middle. If Chinese explorers really visited this place like Gavin Menzies says they did and brought direct information back to the Korean map makers, then why does Africa have no real detail at all? In his book, he has to literally Photoshop the blob for it to look more like Africa. He says this is because the Chinese had no way to measure longitude and didn't know how far west they went. Okay, but surely they'd realize they were heading west for at least a little bit just by looking at the sun? But no, Africa is completely vertical on the map. Also, I love how he insists the coastlines are so accurate when the mapmakers obviously just drew squiggles and apparently forgot the entire continent of India too. If these Chinese sailors didn't realize they were sailing west and forgot a whole continent they just visited, then how could we trust them to actually sail around the planet? If we gave Gavin Menzies a Rorschach test, he'd say it proved China reached America before Columbus. Okay, so next, Gavin Menzies says the Chinese ships sailed to the Cape Verde Islands. Any proof of this? Well, he insists that he found mysterious calligraphy on an old rock. He admits this calligraphy isn't medieval Chinese, but it might be an Indian language. That's right, this is his proof. Very faded calligraphy on a random rock that might be Indian. You better get used to this level of evidence because that's what the rest of the book is like. After reaching Cape Verde, Menzies says the Chinese fleets scattered into the wind. One goes toward North America and two go toward South America. The evidence, believe it or not, just keeps getting thinner and thinner as this book gets further and further from Asia. I wonder why. To prove Chinese sailors reached South America, Gavin Menzies turns to a Turkish map made in 1513. This Piri Reis map has a pretty good depiction of South America, but it was made, of course, after Europeans sailed to that continent. Now, Gavin Menzies goes a step further and says that this map doesn't just depict northern South America, but Patagonia and the Strait of Magellan before Magellan even got there. But I don't buy it. First, I don't see any waterway through this twisted, strange southern continent down here. Once Piri Reis gets south enough, he just kind of sketches out a coastline without much detail. Looks more likely to me that he just thought South America connected to the legendary continent of Australis, which cartographers dreamt up because they thought all the continents to the north needed to be balanced out by a giant continent in the south. Turns out there is a continent in the south, Antarctica, but it's much smaller than anyone thought until they actually found it. Australia, which obviously doesn't touch South America, inherited the name of this imaginary continent. Because every single clue must prove China sailed here, Gavin Menzies even goes so far as to say that this dog-headed man, which the map shows lives way up in the Caribbean, was actually a Mylodon from Patagonia, a species of giant sloth. One problem, they went extinct 10,000 years ago. Why can't this just be a monster man that the author drew into his map? Why does Gavin Menzies feel the need to explain this? Well, because a dog-headed creature is mentioned in a 1430 Chinese book about strange animals found in mysterious, distant lands. I don't know why Gavin Menzies does this to himself. The ancient Greeks had plenty of myths and legends about people with faces on their chest, or backward legs, or dog heads, the kinokaphali. Not every single myth has to be real, unless I suppose you're scrounging for any piece of evidence you can find for your weird book. What's his next piece of proof? Okay, he says that American chickens look suspiciously similar to Asian chickens. Before you laugh, this is a pretty good argument. Maybe the Chinese brought chickens to the Americas. Well, it would be a good argument if scientists hadn't found American chicken bones in the Americas before the Chinese allegedly got there. Now, American chickens might actually be related to Polynesian chickens, which could have drifted across the sea or might have even been brought there by Polynesian sailors before 1400. So no, Chinese sailors didn't bring chickens to America. After exploring South America, kidnapping giant sloths, and telling Native Americans how to read chicken guts for prophecy, the Chinese fleets plunged south for the Strait of Magellan, which they forgot to put in their map. Okay, you know what, I'm just rapidly losing my willpower to respond to all of these random claims, so let's just fast forward. Chapter 6 is titled Voyage to Antarctica and Australia. Remember that Piri Reis map? Well, Gavin Menzies again has a hallucination and insists it's an accurate depiction of Antarctica. This snake monster over here? Well, that's just an elephant seal. After spending some time in the freezing cold, the fleet takes off and zips across the southern seas for Australia. Is there any cartographical evidence of Australia from the 1400s? No, but there is for the 1500s. Does Gavin Menzies count this as proof? Yeah. There's actually a whole historical debate whether or not Portuguese sailors got to Australia in the 1500s, long before Captain Cook and the British. There's even a Wikipedia article on it. But guess what? The idea that Portuguese sailors who sailed extensively throughout the Indian Ocean in the 1500s stumbled upon Australia is much more plausible than Chinese sailors discovering Australia by sailing counterclockwise to the outback in the early 1400s. Chapter 7 also covers a Chinese voyage to Australia, but from the other direction across the entire Pacific. Gavin Menzies goes through various flimsy pieces of evidence, including stone ruins, stories of an old shipwreck, and legends of yellow men, joining among the Aboriginal people. None of this is direct proof, it's just more of the same junk. If Gavin Menzies even made the argument that Chinese sailors were swept beyond Indonesia and stumbled upon Australia from the north, I could probably accept that as possible, but sailing all the way to Patagonia, then to Antarctica, then to Australia, I don't buy it. Oh, also shout out to Nicholas on Buy Me a Coffee, who generously donated and requested a video on Australia. I tried to get my fans to vote on such a video, but their Australophobia blinded them to the light. So for now, this is the highest concentration of Australia in any What Why How video. Okay, where was I? Right, Chapter 8, The Barrier Reef and the Spice Islands. Except, I don't care anymore. Let's just skip to the next chapter, the first colony in the Americas, which is much more exciting. So after that one Chinese fleet sailed all the way to India, to South Africa, to Cape Verde, to the Caribbean, then down to Patagonia, then across the entire Pacific to Australia, Gavin Menzies next has it forget it's supposed to be returning home to China. Instead, it sails back across the Pacific to none other than California. His proof? Well, first he turns to the Waldseemüller map, perhaps the weakest map yet. There's absolutely nothing to suggest anybody visited the west coast of America from this map. It's just a squished blob with mountains. Gavin Menzies has the pure insanity to claim San Francisco and Los Angeles are clearly depicted at the correct latitudes on this map. Utter insanity, he's completely hallucinating. Next, he mentions another random shipwreck that has more evidence than most of being made of Chinese wood from the 1400s. In case you didn't know, shipwrecks don't even need pilots. Boats can get whisked from the seas and dumped on foreign shores without some sort of gargantuan fleet of Chinese sailors driving them there. But Gavin Menzies doesn't just claim Chinese boats visited California, but that Chinese people actually established a long-lasting settlement there, right on the mouth of the Sacramento River. His proof? A book claims Chinese people married with local Native Americans over the centuries because the Native Americans reminded the author of Chinese people. So, no evidence at all. His next piece of extraordinary proof, a 1904 book that claims a Californian village was built by Chinese people because it had walls. That's it, just walls, that's all it takes. This is all it takes for Gavin Menzies to proclaim it certainly seems the Chinese left a settlement in California in the early 1400s. There's no evidence besides this. No written texts, no actual Chinese artifacts, no skeletons, nothing. Gavin Menzies was quite possibly the most gullible person on the entire planet. Any rock, any drawing, any village, any map, any chicken is absolute proof of his thesis. He has considered no alternatives at all. He has completely and utterly brainwashed himself. If you were Gavin Menzies, what would your next piece of proof be? Well, how about you look at Native American societies in North America and try to find any coincidental overlap in the least to Chinese culture. Here's one. Both the Chinese and Western Mexicans made lacquerware. Bingo, that's proof the Chinese visited and taught them, because God forbid anybody do anything without China teaching them how to do it first. As Gavin Menzies has the gall to write, theoretically, if very implausibly, this elaborate and time-consuming process could have evolved simultaneously in China and Mexico, countries thousands of miles apart. He is so delusional that he honestly thinks it is more plausible that China sailed across the entire Pacific Ocean to teach Native Americans than them figuring it out themselves. In the next chapter, Gavin Menzies covers the Caribbean. He turns back to the 1424 Zwain-Pizigano map, which we already rejected at the beginning of the video, but Menzies twists translations of words on the map until they kinda match features on Puerto Rico and Guadalupe. More motivated reasoning. Here's some more bias. Antigua looks like a box, so maybe that's Puerto Rico. But while the imaginary island of Satanazes is also painted as a rectangle, the real island of Guadalupe definitely isn't. How does Menzies fix this? Well, the sailors might have just made an honest mistake based off geography. No matter what the map depicts, it's proof China sailed to the Caribbean. Square island, Puerto Rico, proof. Not a square island? Well, still proof. In Chapter 12, Gavin Menzies turns to more Caribbean shipwrecks that have no proven connection to China. He also says that these stones, the so-called Bimini Road, were actually made up of ballast stones dumped by the Chinese to build a slipway for a wrecked treasure ship. Except Gavin Menzies doesn't have any proof the Chinese had carefully carved ballast stones, or that the Bimini Road was made by any humans at all. Menzies says the stones aren't from the area because they have micrite, but the only source that claims this is apparently a paper from 1979. Other geologists say the stones are made of beach rock, and apparently the Chinese built this slipway the wrong way. The rocks move mostly parallel to the shore, as he depicts on his map. Whoops, I guess the Chinese forgot which direction the beach was. Chapter 13 is named Settlement in North America. Well, before he said the Chinese planted a colony in California, this chapter says they colonized New England too. His first piece of evidence is Giovanni de Verrazzano saying some Native Americans had yellow-colored skin and long black hair. God forbid, who could imagine Native Americans looking like that? The only logical explanation that Menzies can think of is that they were actually Chinese. His next piece of evidence is this stone building in Newport, Rhode Island, which he insists was built by Chinese colonists because the dimensions don't exactly match English measurements. What's a more likely explanation? Some guy in the 1600s used weird dimensions for his stone tower, or Chinese colonists built it? For the rest of the chapter, he continues to ramble about very thin pieces of evidence, like this rock that apparently depicts the Buddha. This is what Gavin Menzies calls a substantial body of evidence. That's a quote. He's scraping the bottom of the barrel. Chapter 14 is called Expedition to the North Pole. That's right, because it wouldn't make any sense for his Chinese fleets to head back the way they came. They just had to sail up Greenland and travel over Siberia to return home to China. His proof of this extraordinary voyage? Well, the Vinland map, of course. The Vinland map does depict parts of North America, but you know what, there's one big problem. It's a complete forgery. It's a fake. How do scientists know? It used inks first produced in the 1920s. Gavin Menzies knows they know this, so he cites the one guy who shed some doubt on their conclusions, Thomas Cahill, whose work has since been proven wrong. Gavin Menzies then says those claiming the Vinland map was a forgery have not remotely satisfied the burden of proof. The burden of proof. This entire book hasn't met any burden of proof at all. This guy's just insane. He's insane. Okay. Anyways, the last few chapters of 1421 argue that tricksy Portugal, learning of Chinese expeditions to the New World, set sail and colonized the Caribbean before Columbus got there. What evidence? More of the same delusional garbage. Why even put this in your book? It's like he hated Christopher Columbus so much he couldn't give him the gold or the silver, so he had to kick him down to the bronze. So let's just end the video. You know, when I read this book for the first time, it wasn't so bad. I wasn't trying to debunk it, I just read it as a fun piece of schlock. But now that I'm actually going through and trying to show people how exactly the book lies and manipulates, it's pretty frustrating. It's 400 pages of brainwashing. So what do we get out of this? What do we learn? Well, if there's one thing we should probably take away from 1421, the year China discovered the world, it's to be skeptical. Not just of mainstream history, which sure, check citations, do your own research or argue with people, that's great, but also be skeptical of these overconfident wackos who plunge into history and other fields and proclaim they've discovered some new miracle interpretation that the crusty old institutions are too decadent to see. These guys, Gavin Menzies, Graham Hancock, David Irving, have brainwashed themselves and others. They're not operating in the same plane of reality as we are. Every piece of evidence can be twisted and manipulated until it fits their theory. It's not provable, it's not disprovable, it's just imaginary. Square pegs into circle holes. Just because someone disagrees with the man or the NPCs or whatever doesn't mean they're right. They're probably wrong, actually. Hopefully people who read 1421 check out the actual history of Zheng He's voyages, because it's an actual interesting story. Comment below if I should make a video about if China really did colonize other continents, or if you have another video idea. And if you like this video, subscribe and check out my Patreon for early previews of future content. Thanks to those who already do. User SEQ, Marklin, Sheba, Caliber, Lehan, Whale, Goblin Stack, Lily, 7-Zip, Sean, Lars, Vantachromia, Jared, Omega, Quincy, Dionisio, Wheatless, Amir, Benjamin, Mysterious Doe, Basit, Mimo, Lord Dan, Samab, Dreher, Channel 101 Productions, Freddy, Party, South Africa, Help Africa, Joshua, and Eric. Thanks, and adios.